Welcome, friends, to Metaphysical Media with Stephen and Steve. I'm Stephen Lewis, and I have here with me my good friend and colleague, Stephen Frampton. How are you doing, Steve?
Very well, Stephen. I'm always very well for our shows. I just really enjoy them.
So do I.
It's like a nice moment by the fireside. I really, really do love our shows.
Yeah, me too, man. One of the things that makes us such fast friends is our mutual love and respect for the stars and the cosmos and astrology and all things esoteric and metaphysical. And today, especially, today of all days, I'm so excited, Steve, because we're going to be talking about something a bit complicated. It's a bit macabre. We're going to be looking at the astrological indication of death in the natal chart of Princess Diana, a very famous personage, and we chose Princess Di not to be gore crows and fetishize her death or to disrespect her, but we chose Princess Diana because her natal chart, her nativity, is a very, very good example and illustration of the astrological signatures of death. Robert Zoller actually uses this chart as an illustration in his works, and it's just a very good chart to learn from, Steve.
It is, Diana's chart is a real testimony to the fact that your whole life is basically delineated by the content of your natal chart. And absolutely. I know that you've got some very interesting things to reveal to our listeners about the natal chart. And I think if anybody's got any skepticism, any remaining skepticism, that will be eliminated today.
It will be dispelled, Steve, because I tell you, one of these signatures we can say coincidence. Two of these signatures we could even, maybe still say coincidence. But 3, 4, 5 of these signatures, all pointing in the same direction. This strains the boundaries of coincidence, Steve. And I want to emphasize to everybody listening that nothing that we're talking about today, none of it causes death, okay? The car crash is what killed Princess Diana. She was killed by the car crash. No planet kills her, okay? So what we're talking, even though I might talk as if this planet killed her or that planet killed her, the fact is the car crash killed her. The planets indicate, they signify, you see. So that's the important thing. And when we judge the death of a native, we're always weighing a variety of different testimonies. And I'll tell you something, Steve. Princess Diana, and for those listening, if you would like to, Princess Di's chart is widely available on the Internet, but the data that I'm using is July the 1st, 1961, 7:45 in the p.m., Sandringham, England, Sandringham, Sandringham, England. And I have reason to suspect, Steve, that the actual birth time of Princess Diana is actually closer to 7:53.5 minutes in the evening. And I'll get into that and explain it well later in the show. But right now, what I want to point out to people is that you can know something about the death of someone just by looking at an ascendant template. And I get this from the writings of Abu Bakr from his On Nativities, coming from the 7th, 8th, or 9th century A.D. Abu Bakr teaches us that you can understand a lot about the death of a person just by looking at their ascendant template. Because, obviously if you have one whole sign rising, that determines what the 8th whole sign is going to be, you see. So let's say, for instance, if someone has Libra rising, then their 8th sign is going to be Taurus. Because Venus rules both Libra and Taurus, Abu Bakr says this sort of person is going to kill themselves. Now, not necessarily on suicide, but even though that's certainly a case, because, but Abu Bakr said the person is going to kill themselves through Venusian things, such as fornication or sexuality or drugs or something like that. Something Venusian is going to lead to the person.
Even though, Stephen, I do very much like whole signs. I've said before that when, you were the one that really encouraged me to look in more detail at whole signs some time ago. But when I looked at my whole sign chart, it really made sense to me. And some outstanding questions about my natal chart were answered when I was able to look at it in whole sign formats. But your point there about the ascendant is a very good one, and I've seen that to be valid even if we're not working with whole signs, because if we analyze the dynamic between the ruler of the 8th house, the house of death, and the ascendant, then we certainly see the extent to which a person may be almost responsible for their own death.
Absolutely.
Or cause their own death.
We sort of participate in our own death, and that makes sense because that's the name of the game.
It does, because you have to be there, Stephen.
Yeah.
It's something you can't delegate, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately, you've got to participate in that. I mean, Firmicus Maternus made a very good point in his writings that even the benefics have to be degraded at some point, because something has to be off. Something has to be wrong. No one lives forever. We all die. And looking at the ascendant template connects a person's life with their death. Let's look at Princess Diana's ascendant template.
Well, Stephen, before we do that, one thing I want to say about death and the benefic planets, Venus and Jupiter, is that it's very much a question of perspective. In the West, we see birth as a wonderful thing and death as a bad thing, generally speaking. And we see being busy and very active, very alpha, consuming things, etc., on the go, do as much as you can. We see that as valuable. And we see the slower times, the quieter times, as less valuable. Somehow, I think, collectively as a society, or a society as cultures. But not everybody has that perspective. And it's a little bit like the dynamic of the North Node and the South Node of the Moon, because we in the West generally see the North Node of the Moon, energy coming in, or a power surge, as a good thing. And we see the South Node of the Moon, a power outage, as a bad thing. And it's again this dynamic of give me more, more, more. The more I can do, the more I can have, the more I can be, the better. Rather than accepting the great value of at times being less, of at times of having less, of slowing, of being still, letting go, releasing. And I think that when we look at death, we have to remember that it's very natural. We're all, life is about dying. We're all dying. We're all living and we're all dying. And death does not have to be seen as a bad thing. I think there's a lot of fear about death because of religious indoctrination. So, of course, if you fear that you're going to burn in hell, then death is a bad thing. You'd be terrified of death. So it has this dreadful stigma attached to it. Because of what we've been told. Because of what we've been told we must believe. Because again, in the Piscean age, it was all about, well, here's some information, Stephen. You believe it. You have to believe this. If you don't believe this and work with it, then you're going to have a problem. But we're in or approaching the Aquarian age, depending on who you speak to, and this is a time of knowing. It's a time of using our own judgment, of gathering information and reflecting, coming to sensible conclusions for ourselves with the brains that God gave us. So my point, or the most important point, is that when you look at a death chart, you see the benefics involved, and they can be involved in a very in a positive way, in the sense that you can see a very harmonious aspect involving a benefic at the time of someone's passing. And I remember one of my students saying, well, how on earth can this is a death chart, how on earth can we have good aspects from Venus or from Jupiter? That doesn't make sense. This person died. And the answer is, well, you're seeing death as a bad thing. And spirit, God, the universe doesn't necessarily think that way. And if you think of it this way, if you were extremely ill at the end of your life, then the relief of letting go of this physical body that's no longer functioning and returning fully to spirit. That's a wonderful thing that should be described by wonderful aspects involving wonderful planets.
Definitely, Steve. Last night, we do a show on Thursday nights at psychicaccesstalkradio.com called The Psychic Viewpoint. An excellent show, outstanding show. And last night I had on guest Pam Salem to talk about deep processing, which involves polarities. Okay? And that's important because, I think we misunderstand death because we see it as being in a polar relationship to life. We see death as being the opposite of life. And I think we stray in that, Steve, because the polar opposite of death is not life. It's birth. So to compare death to life is, first and foremost, just completely inaccurate and wrong. Death is more comparable to birth. And we know from the law of polarity that the two ends of a pole are the same thing. They're equivalent. They cancel each other out in the end. Death is, in fact, another kind of birth, and what lies beyond death is another kind of life. That is the polar opposite of life, not death, you see. And so we all generally tend to think of births as festive occasions. Well, unfortunately, we don't think of death as a festive occasion, and for natural reasons. Now, like you so aptly pointed out, the benefics can definitely be involved in death. They can kill. And death, in the end, is neutral, neither good nor bad. However, there are such things as good and bad deaths. One can the ancients definitely distinguished between good and bad deaths. One can die at home, surrounded by loved ones, or one can die underneath of a payload or with crankcase drainings dripping onto your forehead.
This is really important, Stephen. You raise a really good important point there, because I often say, having passed a spirit, I had a very bad accident many years ago, and my passed and was resuscitated a number of times. And so I experienced being in spirit. And I'm not going to go into detail on that because I don't think now is the right time. But I always say, because I've been to spirit, because I know how wonderful it is to be there, and that's happened to me more than once. I don't have any fear about being in spirit. I don't have any fear about the actual moment of death, the final moment of just completely letting go. But what I fear is, and I probably shouldn't, because I teach people not to fear things, but I think about the way I die. So to your point, I think to myself, well, I'd like to have a very nice death. I would like to be holding hands with the people I love and listening to classical music and just drifting away. So you raise a very good point, and that we shouldn't fear being dead, because we're not dead. It's just a transition, and death is just it's rebirth.
This is the power.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, this is the power of the Ascendant Template, because you and I both have mercurial signs, right? And one reason I love the Ascendant Template, looking and judging death, is because it ties death into birth. It says that your death is going to be like your birth, and it depends upon the circumstances of your birth. They're in this mathematical relationship according to the 360 degrees of the circle.
I'd never thought of that. Of that.
You and I have mercurial signs rising. Abu Bakr said that those with mercurial signs rising will tend to fear death or be nervous about it, because the 8th house for these people like me and you, will be the signs of the malefics. In my case, Capricorn. In your case, Aries. You see, this produces some anxiety surrounding death. Now, looking at Princess Diana's chart, despite the violent circumstances of her death, which are shown by Mars and various other factors, we can see that with Jupiter's sign rising and Jupiter's exaltation sign on the 8th sign away from the rising, that Abu Bakr would have said, to put it bluntly, Princess Di is going to heaven with this, regardless of the circumstances of her death. But to have Jupiter, the priest, to have his sign rising, and to have the sign of his exaltation 8 signs away, this is this means that Princess Diana went to heaven, according to Abu Bakr. The ancients would have seen this as a blessed death.
Well, also, she did, I remember, Stephen, the moment that it was announced. I remember I was in the UK, I was in bed, it was a Sunday morning, and all of the church bells started ringing. Because, you remember that in the UK, it's a much smaller territory. And so you're living in a town or a village. I was in a small town at the time, and there are several churches in that town. Well, if they all start ringing their church bells, you know that something's going on. Something's different. And if it wasn't just that, we're having a service, so here's 5 rings of the church bell. And they didn't stop. And so everybody knew something had happened. And so I got up and checked the news and heard that she died in this dreadful car accident with Dodi Al-Fayed in Paris, in that tunnel. And it is a very strange death, and I'm sure they'll talk about that, because there were some very strange circumstances surrounding her death. But I went to London. I don't know if you remember, but there was an enormous amount of mourning for Diana, and it was a very, very difficult time for the Queen, because people were angry with the Queen. People were angry that Diana had been shunned. She was very loved by the people, and so they named her the People's Princess. And everybody started putting flowers outside Buckingham Palace, which is the Queen's residence.
We mourned
the cross. Diana's residence. And I remember going there, Stephen, and I've never seen anything like it. There were just crowds and crowds and crowds of people around Buckingham Palace, and all of the mall. There were flowers as far as the eyes could see, just everywhere, and people were just crying. It was the most fascinating experience. I don't think I'll ever see something like that again, unless perhaps I go to London when the Queen passes. But it was an incredible moment. She was very loved. And so I think that this Jupiter you're referring to, and this, you said, well, she went to heaven. Well, I think that Jupiter also is describing the warmth, the love for her, the good thoughts about her at the time of her, or after her passing, that people very, very much reacted in a spiritual, religious, and loving way to her death. And I think that is described by this Jupiter, because there's this huge mushroom effect in terms of people's feelings about Diana, their love for her. Again, Jupiter.
Every detail about her death is shown in this chart, and we're going to uncover every last one of them, even down to the injuries. And to have cancer on the 8th sign like that, it means that there's something about her death that is wrapped up in public consumption. Cancer is a sign of consumption, consuming things, and like commercial consumption or the consumption of food, just consumption, consumerism would be a good keyword for cancer, consumerism. And the public nature of Princess Diana's death and her funeral, etc., is shown by cancer. The Bonatti indicates that the sun's contribution to death, when the sun contributes to your death, it makes it public, amidst an assembly, he says. And of course, that not only refers to the laying down of the flowers and all of those things, it also refers to the fact that Princess Diana, had a crash and there were people around. There were she died amidst an assembly. There were all the emergency workers there. It was public. It was there in a main thoroughfare, and she was whisked away from that place to l'Hôpital Pitié-Salpêtrière in Paris.
Stephen, she wasn't whisked away.
Yeah, it took a long time. Yeah,
there were many reports of how strange it is that it took so long to get her to hospital.
What I read, Steve, though, was that this was a standard practice among the French, that their practice of delivering care in accidents of this kind is to focus on the on-site care and then transport the patient once the patient is stabilized. This is what I read was the French's reaction to that.
There may be something to that, but I've read a number of times observations that it was very strange that it took so long to get her the care she needed. And there's a big question mark about whether she actually would have passed if she'd received some of the care that she needed sooner. Very odd.
I definitely think she would have. Her injuries, Steve, I'm pretty sure were lethal, because I'll tell you something. Looking at the planets, and we'll get into the process of, where are the lethal points in this 360-degree circle. They change for everybody, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But let's just say for right now that Jupiter participates in this death, and Jupiter, when he participates in the death of a native, and Jupiter is in pretty bad shape. He's retrograde. He's impeded. So this signifies a death because of an injury to the lung. Jupiter is in the Aries sign of Aquarius. Jupiter is in opposition to the sign of the heart, which is Leo. So this indicates an injury to the lung that supplies the heart with oxygen, or takes oxygen away from the heart and distributes it.
I haven't got. Oh, it is. Of course, you see in this chart. This chart's fascinating because it's just it's all over the place. And of course, you look at Sun and Jupiter. Well, no, I'm not. There isn't an opposition between the Sun and Jupiter.
No, there's not. There's an opposition between Jupiter and the Sun's sign.
I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. See, the traditional method of doing astrology, it says that planets don't just cast aspects to each other. In other words, let's look at Saturn, for example. Saturn in 27 Capricorn. Saturn is afflicting the entire sign of Cancer with his opposition, not just 27 degrees, 48 minutes of Cancer receiving his opposition. That area, of course, will receive the full effect of the maleficence and the evil, without doubt. But the entire function of Cancer is afflicted due to Saturn's opposition. Saturn squares the entire sign of Aries. So this is how I would arrive to the idea that the princess would die from an injury to the lung that causes heart attacks. She did die exactly from the heart attack. Also,
Stephen, the people often forget that the fourth house describes endings, and it's very much a descriptor of the end of one's life.
Very much so.
And you see, her home life and family life was always very difficult. This is a lady who lost her mother. This is a lady who was thrown onto the world stage when she married Prince Charles. This is a lady that had a lot of difficulties integrating into the royal family, and therefore this is a lady that had a lot of anxiety and stress around her home life. Always, I think if we had her with us on the radio show, she'd probably say, yes, my home life was always challenging, family life was always difficult. But you see that the fourth house is also endings, and it's in Aries. It's in the 23rd degree of Aries using the plaster system, and therefore we've got Mars. So Mars in her 8th house, conjunct the North Node, that in itself says accident. It says great force of energy. That passing through a great force of energy. You either pass because you lose energy or because you get too much energy. You either pass because you whittle away, or because a force of energy comes at you and shifts you out of this lifetime. And I think that Mars conjunct the North Node there in the 8th, ruling the 4th, is another good factor that says this person will. It's highly likely that this person would die through an accident or some kind of sudden influx of energy.
That's an excellent observation, Steve. The fourth house has definite overtones of morbidity, and it's one of those factors that we're going to go through in a bit to isolate the one planet that signifies death for Princess Diana. But noting that the fourth house is in Aries, not only does it show the circumstances surrounding her death, an accident, a crash, but it also indicates her origins. Aries is the quintessential sign of Britain itself. And we'll do a solar return, Steve, later in the show, and I'll demonstrate how that indicates the place of Princess Diana's death, which is also in her natal chart, because Leo is associated with the eighth house as well. It's intercepted inside of the eighth house. It's inside of it, and Leo represents France. It always has. Throughout the traditional literature, Leo represents France. And so this is saying that she's going to die.
I'll interrupt you because that really blows me away, of course.
Yeah, isn't it weird?
I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought, well, gosh, there's a relevance in terms of the place she would pass.
Oh, absolutely.
That's very clever.
Yeah, and so if let's say that she was in front of you right now. And let's say that we were crass enough to, prognosticate death for a client, which is an ethical no-no. But let's say that we did that anyway. We would be fully justified in saying to this person, you know what, you're going to die from a crash under some sort of violent circumstance. It's going to be, and it's going to be in France. We would say that because of the proximity mainly to Britain and France. You know what I mean? Because in the modern era, if I did this for a client in Peoria or in Seattle, I wouldn't necessarily say that they would die in France because it's so far away from France. But given the proximity, that just makes it too juicy to pass up. But at any rate, we'd also be justified in saying that you're going to die from an injury to the lung that causes a heart attack. And worse than that, your partner's going to die with you. Your death is, we can tell from this chart that her death is going to be intertwined with her partner's, and furthermore, we can tell from the chart that it's going to be because of money and finances. Unfortunately, looking at Princess Di's chart, we see with Jupiter rising, she's going to want to with Sagittarius rising, her main focus in life, her primary motivation is to influence people through teaching. All the fire signs, when they rise, their primary motivation is to exert influence over others, but for different reasons depending on the sign. Leo wants to influence you through charm. Aries through whatever means necessary. But Sagittarius is going to influence you through philosophy and through teaching. And the effectiveness of Sagittarius to do this for the princess is shown by the condition of Jupiter, which is in a bad condition. Jupiter does not he's retrograde, but, he helps her out. Now, the thing is, Jupiter's in the second house. He's going to fulfill the princess's primary motivation through finances. It takes a lot of finances to feed the world and to travel to Africa and to establish infrastructure there. It takes a lot of finances to move in the social circles she had to move through in order to affect her philanthropic agenda. Do you see what I'm driving at, Stephen? And finances are a bane for her.
Yes,
they're a bane for her. They're not good. Her finances are difficult. The moon is in her second house, messing up her finances. The south node is in her second house, messing up her finances. And so she has to, Dodi Fayed, her partner, was rich. That's not an accident. And if she had not been with Dodi Fayed, she may be still alive today. But the astrology says she was destined to be with someone like Dodi Fayed. She was just naturally designed to seek that type of person out.
I agree with you that her personal finances were a challenge. And definitely the south node of the moon, at 29 degrees Aquarius in her house of finances, the second house, is highly significant. Also, just out of interest, I think that the conjunction of the moon at the south node is one of the factors that also explains that she lost her mother, or that she would lose her mother.
Sure, absolutely.
But her part of fortune is right on the cusp of the 8th house. And I think that describes the fact that she is definitely somebody that can benefit from other people's finances. So she is the kind of character that would have difficulties herself with finances, but it was very likely that she would somehow be saved or would benefit through someone else's finances because of the positioning of her part of fortune in the 8th, and also her part of fortune opposes that Jupiter in the second house of her chart. So, yeah,
right.
But at least I think it's a lot better, isn't it, to say, well, I'm going to have financial difficulties, but people are going to take care of me, people are going to make it okay, than to say I'm going to have financial difficulties and there's no help at hand.
Right, and I definitely do not mean to denigrate the princess by saying I'm definitely not accusing her of being a gold digger or a money grower. Absolutely not.
No, she wasn't.
What I am saying is that with Sagittarius rising, and Jupiter in Aquarius, this is a very powerful humanitarian drive, and Jupiter's position in the second house indicates that Jupiter is going to try to get finances to satisfy that humanitarian impulse. You know what I mean? So it's not as if she were greedy, but she needed wealth in order to do her job on Earth, which is to serve as an icon of benignity and benevolence. Because when she passed, everybody mourned. We all loved Princess Diana in America. We adored her, and we still do. But unfortunately, looking at this nativity, we would be well within our rights to say, Princess Diana, you're going to die with your partner, and your partner is going to die with you. And we'd be justified in saying this, Steve, because Mars in the 8th house is the exaltation ruler of the second. Okay? Now, the second, Mars actually has more power over that particular degree of Capricorn than Saturn himself does. Therefore, we say Mars is the outmutant. Mars is the victor over that degree. So the second house is important, Steve, because of derived houses, because it represents the death of Dodi Fayed.
Yes, of course.
Right? The second house is 8 houses away from the 7th, and the 7th house is your partner. So Mars represents...
I want to make sure that this is really clear for our listeners, because this is such a powerful technique. Looking at the chart to determine another person's finances, for example, and so it's the fact that every house is someone's finances, every house is someone's health, every house in the chart is someone's death.
Right.
And this is a really, really useful technique that enabled a person to look at a chart and just see information that isn't available or accessible to other people that don't understand this technique. So I want to ask you just to take a moment to explain to people. I mean, you did say, the second house is 8 houses away from the 7th, therefore the second house is the death of the partner. But I want you to just give some other examples of that technique so that people can really assimilate that technique and use it if they are working with charts.
Yes, I think that's very important, Steve. Good idea. The technique that we're using here is called, we're deriving a house. Because, you know what, Steve, everybody in our life is in our natal chart. You know what I mean? Other people are in our natal chart, and their relationships are in our natal chart. So let's say the 5th house is your children. That represents your kids. The 11th house would represent your kid's spouse. Why? Because the 11th house is 7 houses away from the 5th. So what you would do, you would count the actual house that you're starting with. We're counting from 0. So what you do, you put your finger on the 5th house and you say 1. On the 6th house and you say 2. Okay, the 6th house would be the second house from the 5th, the finances of your kid. The 7th house, you put your finger on it and you count 3. That's the 3rd house away from the 5th. That's the siblings of the children, perhaps. Then you put your finger on the 8th house and you count 4, right? And then you put your finger. Now, obviously, it doesn't make sense. We use common sense here. It doesn't make sense to say that the 4th house from the 5th is the parents of the children, and therefore serves as an alternate ascendant. You know what I mean? I mean, you might get some philosophical benefit out of meditating like that, but practically, we rule that out by common sense, and we would say this would represent the death of the children, the ending circumstances of the children, or the real estate of the children. You see what I mean? You see how we're always using common sense to guide our delineations for those listening. Okay, so we put our finger on the ninth house and we count 5, the children of the children. So we could say that the ninth house, by derived houses, is the grandchildren of the native, right? Because they're the children of the children, the fifth house from the fifth house. So let's look at anybody. Let's look at the mother. Okay, we have ample precedent for assigning the 10th house to the mother in the literature. Okay, so the spouse of the mother would be 7 houses away. The 4th house, which is the house of the father, right? The illness of the mother would be the 3rd house, because the 3rd house is 6 houses away from the 10th. So if I wanted to talk about the illnesses of Princess Diana's mother, I would look at the 3rd place away from her 10th house. You see, and you can do this with all of the houses. And now, once you do, it helps to have a vocabulary to keep you oriented. Okay, when you derive houses, then the natal chart becomes the root. We call it the root, or the radix, which is a Latin word for root. So if you want to sound fancy, call it the radix. But it's just a term of reference to remind you of the fact that you're dealing with the nativity, and you're just simply deriving houses from that for other people. And if we do that for Princess Diana, we look at her 7th house, which is in Gemini. Okay, and we count 8 houses away. Okay, we arrive at the 2nd house. The 2nd house, therefore, is the death of the partner, because it's 8 houses away from the 7th. Right? And it makes sense, because the 2nd house is in opposition to the 8th house. The 2nd house is my finances, and it's my partner's death. The 8th house is my death, but it's my partner's finances. The logic of it is very, very simple, even if I'm failing to explain it clearly. You know, it's the sort of thing that once you get it, you slap your forehead and was like, oh my God, this is easy. You know, so, you know, if people are having problems with the technique or the concept, they can just type in derived houses astrology in Google, and you'll find a ton of material that will clear up the confusion. In fact, if you're listening to this on archive and you're confused about anything, feel free to pause the interview, to pause our discussion. Look up the relevant concept on Google, or look at the chart to see where we're at, and then resume play on the discussion. And, you know, the rest of what comes later will be so much more meaningful to you. But all tips aside, we can see, looking at the derived houses of Princess Di's natal chart, that Dodi's death was wrapped up in her own, because Mars is the most powerful ruler of the 2nd house, and he is in the 8th. Okay, so Dodi's finances are wrapped up in Princess Diana's 8th house of death. Okay, and also Dodi's house of finances, which is the princess's house of death, is in Cancer, and the moon ruling Cancer is in the 2nd house. So the princess's death is in her finances. This is a linkage between their mutual finances and their death. You know, Mars is fast. Mars indicates that she's going to die from speed. If we switch to whole signs and we just evaluate Cancer as being the 8th place and representing the death, then Mercury there, retrograde, indicates the paparazzo who was chasing her. Bonatti indicates that when Mercury participates in the death of a native, his contribution to the death indicates the end of life by means of a frenzy or mania. You see. So the entire story is there. The injuries, the circumstances, the place of the death, the aftermath of the death. It's all there. And we mentioned earlier in the show how it's not coincidence. To illustrate that principle, let's look at the public nature of this death. There are several testimonies for that. Okay? Maybe if we said, okay, well, the sun in the 8th place away from death indicates a public death. A critic could say, that's coincidence. Okay, sure, no problem. What about Mars in the 8th house conjunct the North Node? That indicates a public death. The nodes are always public because they're derived from the moon. Anytime you have a planet interacting with the nodal axis, it represents something public occurring. So that's a second testimony for a public death. Is that a coincidence now? Mars, however, by whole sign, is in the 10th. The 10th is a very public place. It's your reputation. It's what you do. It's what you're known for. It's public. that's a third testimony to the public nature of this death. And so this strains the credulity of the idea that this could all be a coincidence. And that's just one.
Well,
that's just one category.
That's something we can look at, because that question of coincidence is very interesting. There were reports that Diana was pregnant by Al-Fayed, and obviously there are reports or suggestions that she was murdered. But before we go there, I find it very interesting to compare their charts. I was surprised, or not surprised is probably not the right word, but my eyebrows raised when I first looked at the charts of Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed, because his sun in Aries, ruled by Mars, is on the cusp of her fourth house of endings. And that also is an indicator that they would be together at the end, or that he would be involved somehow in her ending.
Yeah.
It's extremely interesting.
It's all in his 12th house, too. The 12th sign away from his rising sign in Aries, the sun is.
Yeah. But his Uranus is not too far away from the cusp of her 8th house. And his Pluto is in her 8th house, and it's conjunct to what I consider to be the primary ruler of her 8th house, Uranus. And just that conjunction of his Pluto and her Uranus, because it's in her 8th house, and because that Uranus is the primary ruler of her 8th house of death, it says to me that there could well be some criminal or underhand element to the passing.
Now,
there are many other testimonies to that.
What is Uranus's involvement with Princess Dia's 8th house? You have to catch me up to speed here, because I don't really use the outer planet.
Yeah, and I know in traditional astrology we don't use the outer planets, but her Uranus is at 23 degrees Leo. So Uranus is the primary ruler of her 8th house. It's the planet nearest to the cusp.
Right,
and
right.
His Pluto is at 24 degrees Leo. And
Steve, you raised an excellent point that I should clarify right here and now, and I want to emphasize this to all those listening, is that the appearance of a planet inside of a house trumps another planet's ruling that house.
Yes.
Right. Unless the ruler of the house is actually inside the house.
Of course.
Right. So let's look at Princess Di's 2nd house and say that let's switch the places of Jupiter and Saturn. Okay. We might say that Jupiter would be more influential in that house because he's closer to the cusp, but because Saturn rules it, he would trump Jupiter. But in most cases, the planet closest to the cusp is definitely going to dominate the affairs of that house, even more than the ruler. No doubt about that. I'm glad you brought that up, Steve.
Yeah, well, I know there are different ways of working, but I consider, I see the chart as a map of the astral body, a map of the soul. And we know, and you know, and you often point this out, Stephen, that that certain parts of the chart carry more energy. So we know that the 1st house, the 4th house, the 7th and 10th houses are angular, and angular houses pack more of a punch. They literally carry more energy. That's why if we're looking at a chart and there's nothing in an angular house, then it's not a particularly powerful chart. And then the houses that follow the angular houses, the 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th are what we call succedents. They follow, but they carry less energy than angular houses. And then those that follow, the cadent houses, the 3rd, the 9th, the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th, they carry even less energy. And also, my understanding, Stephen, is that when you look at any house, the cusp of the house carries most energy or has most power. So if a planet is if it resides in a house, but it's far from the cusp, then it's in a weaker position than if it were located near to the cusp. So I always consider the first planet in the house to be the primary ruler because it's enjoying more energy, more power. And any other planets in the house following that, i.e. further away from the cusp, are secondary rulers. And then I consider the cusp ruler, but I consider the cusp ruler as secondary to the primary planet in the house, if there is a planet in the house. That's the way I see it.
Well, it's very controversial. It's very weird to talk about how energy is distributed through the houses, because there are a couple of different ways to look at it. It's even kind of confusing, but it's worth pondering. The ancients would think about these places as being advantageous or disadvantageous to the native, or they would refer to it as being a busy place or a not so busy place, or they would refer to it as profiting the native or not profiting the native. And what they would base their logic on most of the time depended on two factors, really. Factor number one, whether or not the house in question aspected the ascendant. Under this scheme, which is going to rule out the 12th house, the second house, the 8th house, and the 6th house. We see that the 3rd house and the 9th house, they still have some power. So this whole idea of which house is, ranking the houses in terms of power, it's a really, really huge question, and it could easily probably take up an entire show in and of itself. But to shortcut the matter substantially, usually the scheme followed is that the 1st to 10th, the houses go in the order of power as follows: the 1st to 10th, the 7th, the 4th, the 11th, the 9th, the 5th, the 3rd. No, I'm sorry. The 2nd is actually going to come before the 3rd. Then the 3rd, then the 6th, and then the 12th. So it's really, really a big deal because, like you said, the placement of the planets in these advantageous or disadvantageous places determines the force, the amount of force that the native is going to have to make a mark on the world. And with Princess Diana, Diana's chart is just so weird, Steve, because I've rarely seen a chart that shows so much variation between the whole sign and the quadrant cusp.
Yes, but you know what I mean? What it says to me when I see that, and when I saw this chart originally, and this is a chart I've looked at quite a lot. What it said to me, the first, and this is not an analytical or necessarily astrological observation of the chart, it was just a gut feel. It's just the feeling that I got when I first glanced at her chart. And that feeling is, well, some of the houses are really, really squashed because of the nature of the chart. And my feeling was, gosh, parts of this person really squash other parts of this person, or parts of this person's life are very prominent and completely squash other parts of this person's life.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make that point because it was a really strong impression that I had. And we know that is the case with Diana. So what question I've got for you actually is that with the traditional astrology techniques, because you're the expert on the traditional astrology, is there a rule that would correlate with this feeling that parts of her are squashed by other parts of her, or parts of her life are suppressed by other areas of her life?
The ancients would refer to a chart like this as not being upright. Is lacking uprightness. Now, this isn't a moral judgment. They're not saying the princess is not upright, but this is how they would just describe the skew of this chart, which is very technical in nature and yet has metaphysical import. Because you're quite right. The quadrant from the 10th house to the ascendant is rather squished. Anybody looking at the chart will see that the 12th house cusp is in Sagittarius, and the rising degree is in Sagittarius. So Sagittarius occupies 2 houses. Now, correspondingly, the quadrant from the ascendant to the Cheli, the 4th house cusp, it's huge. It's massive. One might expect, especially psychological astrologers and modern astrologers, might expect an insane amount of processing and internal development going on through that quadrant of the zodiac, those particular houses. You look at the 2nd house, look at all the activity going on there. 3 planets, a sign intercepted within it, a lot of activity. So the modern astrologer would have to be impressed. I don't see how modern astrologers would be able to fail to correlate the 8th house and the 2nd house dynamics, given the extreme development of this axis. Now, the technical ideas behind this squishness, the ancients would actually see this as quite good. Quite good. The reverse situation, where the more development would be the big houses, for lack of a better word, the spacious houses, would be in the midheaven to the ascendant quadrant and the IC to the descendant quadrant, where these are the big houses, and the midheaven is in the 9th. They would see this as a reduction of the force of the midheaven and consequently a bad thing. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, Steve, because to my thinking, the midheaven in the 9th house is a philosopher king. You know what I mean? It's someone whose reputation, whose actions, whose profession is going to be religious, philosophical, educational, something of that nature. You see what I'm driving at, Steve? Whereas someone with the midheaven in the 11th house, like Princess Diana's, which would, squash those other houses, this is a person whose reputation, profession, and deeds are going to revolve around society, her friends. You see what I'm saying? Even associates to the ruling class, because the ruling class is the 10th, and the 2nd house represents advisors to the ruling class. Organization. The 11th house is organization. Hopes and dreams. All of these things. That's where the profession goes after, as opposed to when that particular region that you're saying is squished, when that thing is accordioned outward, when we drag the midheaven degree all the way over to the 9th house, then the ancients saw that as a reduction in the force of the native's profession and reputation and his deeds. So I hope that helps answer your question, Steve.
Well, it does. I was observing that the Venus in Taurus in her 5th house of romance and kids, and
yes.
Venus under its own sign of Taurus, it particularly is interesting. And she did have a wonderful relationship with her boys.
Yes,
she worshipped them. They were very, very close. And so that this is a simple point, but that Venus in its own sign, embedded nicely in her 5th house, describes the desire to have children, the romantic, passionate side of Diana, but also the very positive relationship that she had with her boys.
Yes, not only that, it says that her children are going to be attractive children, because Venus is attractive. Venus in the sign of her rulership is very attractive. Now, if Venus had been in Virgo, those 2 young men would have been butt ugly, because that's the sign of her fall. I'm serious. Men with Venus in Virgo, a lot of times they'll be attracted to women that are conventionally quite hideous.
But that Venus is very interesting because you see it forms a trine to Saturn, and Saturn's in her 1st house. I know it's far down there in the 1st house, on the cusp of the 2nd if we use the Placidus house system. But there's this nice trine from Venus to Saturn. Although a trine involving a major malefic, in my opinion, is not necessarily benefic, it won't necessarily express itself as benefic. So people often say, a harmonious aspect means something harmonious, but if it's a harmonious aspect involving something that's potentially bad, it's not necessarily a good thing. But, you see her Venus in the 5th, and let's face it, she was having a relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed, who was a Muslim, and nothing against Muslims by any means, but she was having a relationship with Al-Fayed as the mother of the future King of England. Now, personally, I couldn't care less who she was with, or whether she's with a Christian or a spiritualist or a Muslim. It makes no difference to me. But apparently, this was a big dilemma for the monarchy, because it meant that the future King of England could have had a Muslim sibling, and the fact that this was a consideration is really irritating, to be quite honest with you, because it shouldn't be relevant, but it was relevant apparently. And when you look at that Venus in her 5th house, she was in love. She had a cold relationship with Charles, and I'm not saying that Charles is a dreadful person, but we know that they had a pretty miserable relationship. There wasn't much love going on there. And in fairness to Diana and probably to Charles, it was a marriage. Their marriage was a duty. It was really a marriage that was more about responsibility towards the role that Charles was born into, and the role that Diana was born into, given that she was an aristocrat. But she was in love with Al-Fayed, and she was having a good time at last. She was actually enjoying life. She had a terrible time, and this Venus is in her 5th house, so this is something that was very important to her. Her boys were still important to her, Venus in the 5th. But you see that Venus is squared by Saturn. And, sorry, it's trimed by Saturn, but it's semi-squared the Sun, one of the luminaries, bringers of life. And it's square the Moon, the other luminary or bringer of life, that was weakened because it was at its own south node. It doesn't like being at its south node. It dislikes even more being at its north node. But also, very importantly, this Venus squares Uranus, primary ruler of the House of Death, and it therefore squares the north node of the Moon. So that Venus is very interesting, Stephen, because it describes a lot about the circumstances of what was going on in her life at the time of her passing.
I'm chuckling about that Uranus in conjunction with the North Node in the 8th house, because you know what? It just hit me all of a sudden that this probably very accurately describes the reaction of Diana's partner when he gets her credit card statements. You know what I mean? You're right about Prince Charles. It's interesting. If we did a show, if the topic of the show were marriage, we could definitely illustrate that as well. Because as soon as the princess's ascendant profected to the sign ruled by Mercury, which is the significator of her marriage, she got married to the prince. And the prince's, the fact that it would be an unfortunate marriage is shown by the prince retrograde combusts the sun, so
yeah, even just the fact that her 7th house is Gemini is a strong indicator that she would marry again, or that she wouldn't stay in that relationship. There's nearly always a separation or a remarriage, a second relationship, when you see Gemini on the cusp of the 7th. So wherever you see Gemini in the chart, you see this sort of duplication or repetition, because obviously it's twins.
Absolutely, and both individuals are shown by the planets, the Sun and Mercury. And you're quite right, Stephen, that when you have a mutable sign on the 7th house cusp, that often indicates at least 2 partners. And you're quite right about Venus in Taurus representing Islam. I've said plenty of times. Venus is a universal indicator of Islam. And it's so interesting how you pointed out the nature of the trine between Venus and Saturn. It's a big question. It's a big question. How does a malefic affect the benefic when it's in trine to that benefic? It's different from the square. The square is a little easier to interpret.
Yeah, I know you know the answer, so I know you're right. It's rhetorical. You're not asking me to answer it, but in my opinion, obviously it's better than a square, as you said. It's better than a tight opposition, and it has its advantages. So her one thing I would say is she was a good mother. If you think of Saturn, the planet of responsibility, it's in its own sign of Capricorn in her first house. Admittedly, it's not near the ascendant, but it is in her first house, and it trines her Venus at the fifth. And one of the positive expressions of that is that this is somebody who was completely devoted to her boys. She worshipped them, and she took her responsibilities as a mother very, very seriously. It was a duty to her, and that duty is described by the Saturn in Capricorn trining her Venus in Taurus in the fifth, the house of kids. But it's not, as in my opinion, I'd rather have a nice trine from the Sun to Venus or from Jupiter to Venus than Saturn. But Saturn's got to be somewhere in your chart, and it has to form some aspect to something, even if it's a cusp.
Absolutely.
It plays its role. It's part of life. It's all of these planets, all of these signs of the zodiac, they're just describing life generally and what there is to assimilate on the Earth plane. So you have to have Saturn in your chart. You have to have Jupiter in your chart. You can't escape from it. We chose to be here.
This aspect is quite complicated because normally when a malefic is in a positive aspect to a good planet, usually what happens is we get a middling result. If Saturn were squaring Venus instead of trining it, then we would expect Saturn to reduce all of Venus or eliminate Venus's beneficence, to reverse the good things that Venus will produce for Princess Diana. But because of the trine, Saturn won't eliminate these things, but he will reduce the overall beneficence of their effects. But perhaps not so much, and I'll tell you why not so much, because Saturn happens to be in the sign that he rules, and he also happens to be, let me just double check this, I want to say he is the ruler of his term as well. I'm just double checking this. Yeah. So Saturn is highly dignified. Saturn is extremely dignified. So this is going to improve things quite a bit as well. But I think any contact with the malefic is going to be troubling, and I think the troubling nature of the trine is indicated by the points that you brought up before, that there's going to be a huge amount of, as they might call it, controversy over Diana's coupling with Mr. Al-Sayed. There was a great amount of controversy because of this, and it had financial implications because Saturn is in the second house. Saturn in the second house almost always indicates a cash flow for the native that is too little. But when Saturn is in its sign, the sign that he rules and has dignity, some kind of dignity, he can be converted into an energy of accumulation. And we see that process at work with Dodi, through the trine of Saturn to Venus. Now, and as we pointed out, Venus will also represent the two young princes. And I got to tell you, Steve, I've never liked how people refer to Prince Harry as the spare. I've always considered that extremely rude and disrespectful because, Prince Harry, and I'm hopping on a soapbox temporarily here to castigate the entire population of Britain who does this abominable thing.
Stephen, you can't deny, though, that he does look very much like Hewitt. He
like
really
who?
looks like James Hewitt. He looks just like James Hewitt. Diana had a relationship. She had an affair. And I'm sure Charles had many, but Diana had an affair with James Hewitt. I think his first name was James. I'm sure we'll have to look up. And to be honest, Stephen, I think that we could do 5 shows on Diana because we haven't even skimmed the surface yet, and we're almost we're far past the halfway mark in the show. But you go on the internet, you Google James Hewitt, and you Google Harry, and they look
How interesting. Because now that you mention it, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, well, at any rate, we could do 5 shows on this very, very interesting individual. But I tell you what, Steve, let's get back on topic here and look at some more of the astrology.
Before we do, humor me, because before we get back on topic, I want to just make one point.
Okay.
And this point could be the subject of another show on Diana. If you look at the synastry between Queen Elizabeth II and Diana, it's horrid.
They didn't get along.
It is horrid. I mean, if you showed me these charts and said, Steve, one of these is your charts, one of these is a friend I want to introduce to you, I'd say, Stephen, don't bring your friend near me. It's all about the Queen, but these two just would not get on. I mean, and then again, we could do a whole show just on the synastry of the relationship between, or lack of relationship between.
I'll tell you what,
let's go back to the topic.
Well, now that you bring that up, before we get back on topic, I got to make a very, very quick sub point here about what you just brought up. I mean, we don't even have to. I mean, we could do a synastry and it would be great. We get all sorts of information, but the story is also told right here in the Nativity without casting even the second chart. Because I'll tell you something, the 7th house is her partner, right, Prince Charles, and his mother is shown by the 10th house away from that. We're going back to derived houses here. We're going to derive the Queen sign from that of Diana's husband, right? And we get Pisces, and its ruler is the same as Princess Diana's ascendant ruler. Let me just point that out. So that shows probably a begrudging sort of similarity between the two women, that probably fueled their dislike of each other. But Jupiter is in the 12th house, the 12th sign away from Pisces. Jupiter is in aversion to Pisces. Jupiter doesn't aspect the sign that he rules, Pisces. So this afflicts the Queen. This indicates the relationship of Princess Diana to the Queen. She's a 12th house sort of entity to the Queen, a secret enemy. We get that information from deriving the houses. And then we could, seeing this, wow, let's assume we didn't know the princess was famous. Let's assume we don't even know the princess's name. We just see a generic, we just see this nativity unnamed. We could say, wow, let me see the chart of this lady's mother-in-law. I can tell you they hate each other. But anyway, now we can get back.
That could be the subject of another show. Even the synastry between Charles and Diana could be the subject of another show. We could do a show on the progressed charts of the Queen, Charles, Al-Fayed, and Diana at the time of death. We could do a bit of investigative work. But I have looked at that before, and certainly there are a lot of unanswered questions about the circumstances of her passing.
Synastry is just such an awesome technique. I do it quite a bit for my clients. So definitely before you get married, you need to call me up so I can tell you whether or not he's the marrying kind or the murdering kind. You know what I mean?
I honestly, Stephen, I don't think that people should get into a relationship unless they've actually looked at that.
Nor do I. And if you live in India, you wouldn't dare get married without first consulting an astrologer. You would consider such an action the height of folly. You know what I mean?
It's
but
so
at any rate,
powerful. There's so much information available about the extent to which two people are compatible physically, spiritually, emotionally.
It's one of the most important decisions of your life. You know what I mean? Here in America, and I'm guilty as charged. I'm not exempting myself from this. Here in America, the attitude toward marriage is, what the hell? Let's just go ahead and do it. And, if it doesn't work out, that's what they got Vegas for. Screw it. You know what I mean? Let's just take a gamble. But at any rate.
Can you get a drive-through divorce?
Oh, why not? Yeah, sure.
You have two lanes.
Yeah, it probably works better.
In the same vehicle.
You can probably get a Big Mac while you're doing it.
Yeah. But
at any rate, getting back to the topic here of Princess Diana's astrological indications of mortality. Let's pretend that this is just a generic nativity. We don't know it's Princess Diana's, and we've considered all these factors. Now, first of all, let me tell you, by profections, that will time out the death. Okay, because as soon as every time the princess has a first house year, she will be at risk for death. Every time the ascendant profects back to its starting place, the princess will be at risk for death. Why? Because then all of these deadly planets will be activated. Bonatti lists 17 destroyers. Not all of them are going to kill you, but all of them can. And they're not always necessarily planets. They can be points. For example, the Arabic part of death. The princess has that at 29 degrees Gemini. Mercury rules it. So there are a ton of points that we would consider in terms of isolating that one planet that will kill Princess Diana. And to do that, to get there, we have to find a couple of more planets. Because right now, at this point, Steve, we want to know generally how long this native is going to live. We're not interested so much in assigning a year value to that or an age value yet. We want to ballpark it. That's all. And in order to ballpark it, we have to find a planet called the Hillaj, which is the giver of life.
Oh, this is a really interesting exercise.
It is.
I think it's really good that we cover this, Stephen, because people often ask this question, which planet is my Hillaj? So it's good to use Diana as an example to help people determine which planet is that Hillaj.
It is, because I'll tell you something, why her chart is good to demonstrate this topic, Steve, is because it's hard as hell to find her Hillaj. Mm-hmm. She has a few different candidates. And that right there, that alone has gotten my guard up. You know what I mean? I'm not expecting extreme longevity from this native simply because I have to hunt for her Hillaj. I have to scout for it. You know what I mean? It's not obvious. It's not
Hold
in...
Hold on a second, Stephen. There's a policeman at my door, and I'm sitting here on the radio show, so I have to leave you for a second.
Sure thing.
Okay?
I'll just continue. Sure thing, buddy. Good luck.
Okay. I'll just go on mute for a second.
Sure thing, bro. Wow. Let's all wish Steve good luck with that officer there. Talk about bad timing. Talk about a coincidence, huh? At any rate, we have to find the princess's Hillaj, that one planet that represents her life force, okay? Because that's what the Hillaj is. This comes from the Persian tradition of Masha'Allah and Abu Ma'ashar and folks like that. It comes from the mists of history. So the Hillaj, the way to find the Hillaj, first of all, we have to answer one very important question, one very basic question. And it's a division of nativities that it goes ignored. It goes unexamined in the majority of modern astrology. The most basic division of all, is yours a day birth or a night birth? Right? The answer to that one question determines the computation of Arabic parts. It determines the sequence of time lords in your Fird Ariya. It determines the triplicity lords of houses. So it's very important. Princess Diana, she's a follower of the diurnal sect. She was born in the day. So we would first examine her sun and see if it is fit to be the Hillaj. And here's where things get complicated, because there are several opinions and methods for finding the Hillaj. Ptolemy would say that this sun is competent to be the Hillaj. Okay? If we use whole signs, Ptolemy would actually prefer Mars, because Mars is in the 10th sign away from the rising sign. Bonatti's opinion is very important. Most astrologers are going to use either Ptolemy's method or Bonatti's method. Bonatti's method would name either the part of fortune or the moon as the Hillaj. And now, what do I think? I rule out the sun. I don't think the sun can serve as the symbol of her life force, even though he is the planet that rules the day sect. The sun is not fit to be the Hillaj because it's in a feminine sign. That rules it out. Usually, in the 7th house, we would not expect to find a Hillaj because the 7th, traditionally, was very similar to the 8th house. Earlier in the show, I made some comments about death being the polar opposite of birth, not life. And this is symbolized in the 7th house because it's the setting place. It's where the planets sink beneath the horizon and enter the underworld. So it could be a coincidence that marriage is also associated with the west, the setting place, the descendant, the 7th house. Okay, so in other words, the 7th house is rather antithetical to life, no? It's in opposition to the ascendant. It fights against the body. So to have the life force, a planet that represents your vitality in the seventh house, that's a big strike against it. And if the sun had been in a masculine sign, Leo, for example, or Libra, then perhaps he could be fit to symbolize the princess's life force, but he can't. Okay, so let's look at the moon. I would prefer the moon to the part of fortune. Even though that moon is in the second house, by whole signs it's in the third. Even though it's conjunct the south node, I think the moon would be the Helaj. And it makes sense. The princess didn't live very long. You know, we know this now. We have the benefit of hindsight, obviously. But looking at it ex ante facto, looking at it before the princess died, okay, it would be perhaps, we'd be operating blind. We would have no idea when she died. We'd have no idea what to expect. So we'd have to experiment with the part of fortune or the moon. So let's say it's the moon. Now, we've found the Helaj. This is her life force. We have to now isolate a planet called the Kadukuda. Okay, this is the planet that will assign a numerical value to that life force. Now we're getting a year. Now we're going to find out how long the native will live. Okay, so to find the planet that is going to serve as the giver of years, we want to find that planet that aspects the Helaj. Now, usually we want the planet aspecting the Helaj to do so to be a planet that is a ruler of the Helaj, right? So in other words, the moon is in the sign that Saturn rules. The moon is in the triplicity of Saturn, the term of Saturn. It would be nice if Saturn would aspect the moon. Then it would be a very healthy giver of years, but it doesn't. So we can't use Saturn. The moon's aspects are with Mars, Mercury, Venus. Those are the important aspects. So one of these three planets will be the giver of years. Mercury is a good one because it trines the moon. It supports the moon. However, because Mercury is in the seventh house, because Mercury is retrograde and combust especially, in this case, Mercury is not going to give its full complement of years. It's not going to give the amount of years. If Mercury had been healthier, it would be able to have given the princess 76 years. But because it's not, because it's impeded, it's only going to give the princess 20 years of life. But we know that the princess lived to the age of 37. So now we look at planets aspecting the giver of years. Okay, so this is a third category of planets. First, we isolated the planet that represents the life force. And we did that by looking at the strongest planet in one of the life-giving places of the chart. Next, we find the planet that gives the years to that life force. And it's going to be a planet aspecting the Helaj. We determined that planet to be Mercury. So next, we figure out how those years are modified by planets aspecting Mercury. Mercury, unfortunately, is, like I said, it's combust, and it's also sextile Mars. So Mars is going to add years to Mercury. Mars is, in fact, going to add its minor years to Mercury. Its minor years are 15. So judging this way, we would say that the princess would live to 35 years. And again, we're ballparking. Okay, she actually lives to be 37, if memory serves. So we're off by 2 years. Not a big deal. We wouldn't have known that again if we were doing this before the princess passed away, or if we didn't know who the chart belonged to. But we wouldn't be far off. I mean, 35, 37 years. Now we're going to fine-tune it. And the way we do that, we have to use the technique of primary directions. We're going to uncover something called the arc of life, the arcus vitae, okay? And it's an arc of distance, right? The distance is between the ascendant, which is the body, and some malefic planet. Usually it's going to be the killing planet, okay? The killing planet. It's that one planet that has your name written on it. Okay, it goes by a lot of different names. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I'm back. I was just thinking it was quite, sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted you to know I'm back. I was thinking it was quite strange how just after we were talking about whether Diana's death was suspicious, the police turn up at my door, at my home, saying that they're here to investigate. And I said, well, what are you here to investigate? What's happening? And they said, well, your alarm's been going off. And I said, well, it hasn't, because I'm here and it's not even switched on.
Oh my goodness! Well,
it was quite strange because we were talking about the suspicious circumstances of Diana's death. So let me ask you: did you explain to people what the hillage is in Diana's chart? Or which branch is the hillage?
I did. I explained that we have a method by Ptolemy to find it, and a method by Bonatti, and that I'm using the method of Bonatti. And I'll tell you something, Steve. I've come to the conclusion that the moon is actually the hillage. Okay. So the moon, and right off the bat, this is not
you don't want your hillage at the south node of the
Right, exactly. So I'm not thinking this is going to be a very long-lived native. And of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, as I mentioned. But the next step, we've isolated the giver of life. So now we want to enumerate the years. We want to assign a numeric value to that life force, to that vitality. And to do that, we find the Kaduhuda, the giver of years.
Even before doing that, the moon in Diana's chart is a real problem because she has dreadful aspects to her moon. And if you would define if we say, well, the hillage is the moon, then we're always looking at a problem here, because her moon square the sun, it's square Venus, opposition Uranus, opposition Mars, opposition North Node, it sits at its South Node, and so it's an unfortunate planet for her to have as her hillage, for sure.
Right.
It is also, Stephen, something that is relevant if we were to talk about Diana's nature, her emotional nature, because her moon is very problematic.
Yeah, it all affects.
I don't want to divert or for us to start talking about her emotions or her emotional state.
Well, I mean, it's a complicated.
For another show, but I'm interested to see. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I'm interested to see which planet you defined as the killing planet.
Yes, we're definitely getting there. Now, as you mentioned, her moon has definitely got some issues. It's void of course. It's not a good moon. And unfortunately, it's the hillage. It symbolizes her life force. So she doesn't have a very powerful life force to begin with. And all of those nasty aspects that you mentioned, they're going to affect that vitality. Mm-hmm. Now, in order to say how many years this native is going to have, we want to look for the Kaduhuda, what the Latin writers called the Alcocode. They bastardized the Persian Kaduhuda, al-Kaduhuda into Alcocode. And essentially it's just the giver of years. And the major planets aspecting the moon that can qualify, I would consider Mercury to be the Kaduhuda, because it regards the moon by a trine. Even though it's an out-of-sign trine, there's still an aspect of a trine. Now, because Mercury is aspecting from an out-of-sign trine, because Mercury is retrograde, because Mercury is under the beams of the sun, then it's not going to be able to give its major or its medium years. It's going to only be capable of giving its minor years, which are 20. Okay? So now, and this is standard practice. We not only look at the planet that aspects the moon to be the hillage, and as I said, in the best case scenario, we would want that planet to be one of the hillage's rulers. And I mentioned while you were away, Steve, that the moon is in the sign, the term, and the triplicity of Saturn, and Saturn does not aspect the moon. If Saturn had aspected the moon, we'd get more longevity. If Mercury had been the term or the bound ruler or the triplicity ruler, we would have gotten more longevity, perhaps. But no, we only get 20 years from Mercury. And next step, and this is standard, we see what planets connect with Mercury, because these are going to add or subtract time according to their condition. Now, Mercury is in a sextile with Mars. okay? And this is going to add the minor years of Mars, okay, which is number 15. So Mercury is going to give 20 years, and Mars is going to give 15 years. This gives us 35 years. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, Steve, at this point, we're just ballparking it. Okay, we want that ballpark number because we want to zoom in and focus on some part of this native's life. I mentioned earlier how every time the native's ascendant profects to the first house, it's going to be, that native is going to be at risk for death. This particular native princess died because of the peculiar mechanics of this chart, which we've been discussing up till now. But why? Now, the ascendant is going to return to its place every 12 years, when she's 12, when she's 24, when she's 36. Why didn't she die when she was 12 or 24? Because these computations of the Halaj and Al-Qakodan give us 35 years. We're not expecting death before 35 years. We're not expecting death at 70, at 48 years. We're expecting it in the 30s. Okay, so now we have a range we can zoom in on, you see. So we look at the Firdaria lords. Okay, in her 30s, these are going to be the moon. The moon is going to be the major Firdar ruler. Okay, so it's kind of getting worse here. So what we do is we do solar returns for her, the years in her 30s, and the best way, like you said, you asked originally about the killing planet. There are a lot of names for this planet. The Anareta is one name of it. The Planeta Interficiens is another name of it. The Abscissor is yet another name for this planet, and I like it because it reminds me of Clotho, the Greek Moirai, the Greek fate who clipped the thread of life. I compare the thread of life of the three Greek Moirai, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. That thread that they spin out and clip, that's the arcus vitae, the arc of life, which is a primary direction from the ascendant to the killing planet. The ascendant representing the body to the killing planet, that conjunction. This is the technique of primary directions that's going to yield the date, the age that this native is going to die. It's not an easy technique. And as you can see, we use a variety of different predictive methods to home in on the time, the season of death for this native, and then finally we use the most powerful technique of all to get. Okay, we've ballparked it up to this point, but now we're going to use the most powerful technique of all to get to the date. And this is why I say I suspect the princess was born at 7:53:30 in the evening instead of 7:45 in the evening. Okay, because when you okay, let's give a little background here. We're not talking when we use the technique of primary directions. Okay, let's look at this. Let's look at the circular chart for her birth. Okay, essentially we're going to direct points to the ascendant. So we keep the ascendant still. So imagine yourself reaching out and grasping the chart and rotating it slowly clockwise. Click, 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 degree by degree. Each of those degrees is roughly a year. A little more, a little less. It depends on the sign. And the astronomy of this is complicated, Steve. Because even though we're clicking along degree by degree, we're moving on the ecliptic. However, the actual distances are measured on the plane of the equator. So we have to convert these degrees of ecliptic zodiacal longitude into ascensions. Degrees on the equator, the celestial equator. That's where the planets are. That's where we have to do the directions. That's where the arc of life, the arcus vitae, is. So we have to convert from zodiacal degrees into ascensions. Okay, so the way we do this, we would take the right ascensions of the midheaven, 23 degrees, 3 minutes of Libra, and we would convert those into absolute zodiacal longitude, and then convert that into degrees of right ascension. Now, because the ascendant exists in a perfect mathematical relationship in ascension to the midheaven, we simply add 90 to get the ascensions of the ascendant. Now we've got the ascensions of the ascendant, what's called the oblique ascensions, what the ancients referred to in their writings as the ascensions of the clime or the city or the regions that you live in. We take this number and we subtract it from the position in right ascension of the planet that we're directing to, and that difference, we convert it into a date. That's the arc of life. Now, we're not going to do all that mathematical mumbo-jumbo here, because we can estimate visually by just sticking to degrees of zodiacal longitude. That serves our purposes here, okay? So we're clicking the circle around. We're keeping the ascendant still, but Saturn is the killing planet, okay? And the reason Saturn's the killing planet is because he has the most dignity over several places. These places are given to us by Abu Ali al-Khayyat in his Judgments of Nativities. And it's verified by Bonatti and by many other ancient masters. We examined the ascendant, ironically enough. But it makes sense. Your death is in your body, so we examine your body, the ascendant. And this brings into play, also the ascendant template I referred to earlier is pertinent here. So it makes sense that we look at the ascendant. With the planet that has the most dignities and strength in all of these places I'm about to mention is the Planeta Interfician, the killing planet. It's the planet with your name on it. And it's coming for you. And it's coming for me. It's coming for us all. At any rate, it's not what's going to kill you. It doesn't kill you, but it signifies our death. At any rate, we examine the ascendant, the place of the ruler of the ascendant, the degree of the part of death, the degree of the lord of the part of death, the degree of the fourth house, the degree of the lord of the fourth house, the degree of the triplicity lord of the fourth house, the eighth sign from the sun, and the ruler of the eighth sign from the sun. The one planet that has we taught up the dignities of all the planets in all of these places. I do this using an Excel spreadsheet. And sometimes, if I feel like it, if I'm waking up with a wild hair up my butt that day, I might toss in the essential dignities of Ibn Ezra and add them into the calculation. I'm experimenting with that method. But at any rate, at the end of this tortuous process, we get Saturn. Saturn's the winner. Saturn is what the Arabs would have called Al-Mubtaz, the victor. He's the killing planet. And so we direct the ascendant to Saturn to derive the date of death for this native. And when we do that, let me go ahead and do that. Now, I did it a million times. Let me redo that calculation. Oh, crap. When we do it, we come to within a month of her actual date of death in August 1997. I want to say, hold on, let me actually perform the calculation. Let's see. Saturn is at 27 degrees, 48 minutes Capricorn. That's fine. And we're going to direct the ascendant. Okay, now, here's the problem. With a 7:45 birth time, it's going to yield a direction in 1999. You see what I'm saying? That's way off. Okay? That's way off. The princess is 38 years old at this time. October 14th, 1999 is when the ascendant reaches Saturn, if the princess was born at 7:45. However, if the princess was born 8 minutes later, and the credit for this goes to Robert Zoller. He is actually the one who performed this rectification. Let me find my chart, Steve. Princess die. I'm not so hot with alphabetical order these days, Steve. I don't know what it is, man, but I'm getting old. 7:53:30. If we rectify the chart to 7:53:30, and then perform the direction of the ascendant to Saturn, then the direction times out for August 27th, 1997. When did the princess actually die, Steve? Refresh my memory, please.
I can't remember the exact date. I'll get it. I'll Google it. But it's interesting that Saturn is right in opposition to the cusp of her age. So it does make sense that Saturn is the candidate.
Saturn has the most dignities. All of those places that I listed, Steve, the ascendant, the fourth house and the position of its triplicity ruler and its domicile ruler. All of these places are places of morbidity within the 360 degrees of the circle, and they change for each person depending on the placement of 1 degree and 1 degree only. the
No,
ascendant.
he squares the midheaven and the IC as well.
Yeah, now
He's
Princess
squaring
Diana,
that.
she died on August the 31st, 1997, Steve. August the 31st.
And it was in the evening, wasn't it? It was just after, oh no, it was early, very early in the morning. It was after midnight.
Yeah, it was, the sun was
12:30 or 1 a.m.
Right. So using this is why primary directions are so powerful, Steve. Using them on an accurately timed birth chart look, the date of death is timed to within a few days. That's remarkable.
What I don't understand though is because Diana did use an astrologer at times. I don't understand how she was in circulation at this time.
What do you mean?
Because a good astrologer should have advised her to be very, very cautious at that time.
This was her fate. She would have felt an overwhelming urge. She wouldn't have been thinking. We don't tend to think that we're going to die anytime. When and her astrologers either A, didn't possess these techniques, or B, would not have framed it in these sorts of terms. It's not really my place to tell people when they're going to die. I check this stuff for my clients.
But it is our place to say to a client, look, September is a risky time for you. You need to be on your best behavior, lie low. That there's more chance of problems or such as an accident in September than other times. So
we'd have to tell her
to draw the client's attention to a potential problem, particularly like this. It just surprises me that she wasn't aware that she didn't perceive. In fairness, maybe she didn't think that going for dinner in Paris and being driven from the hotel or restaurant would represent high risk. It shouldn't have represented a high level of risk.
And she didn't.
The driver was moving at such incredible speed. That's
strange. Mars and Virgo in the 8th house. I would have told the princess, hey, don't travel. Don't go anywhere with your partner. I would have known Mars would have represented death from the partner and probably from speed or something like that. We could have said, don't take that trip to France this year. Don't avoid France this entire year, because we would have known she would have been at risk for death this year because of the perfection and the solar return, and because of we would already have been expecting her death this year. You know what I mean? So we would have said, don't do this, don't do that, don't go here, don't go there. And could she have dodged the bullet? Actually, I don't even know. She has a killing planet, and the killing planet speaks in this chart. You know what I mean? That was the end of her time. There's nothing anybody could help with that. It would be the most extreme astrological aberration for her to have exceeded that time. It would have been contrary to the laws of the cosmos.
Well, that would be a great piece of research for us to do at some point, actually.
That's
actually looking at that, because I like to think that I can navigate my way past a problematic point in my chart. I'm
reminded of the Final Destination franchise of movies, where the whole premise of the movie is the Grim Reaper comes back to get vengeance on those who were clever enough to dodge him. And, the whole point of the entire franchise is that your efforts to dodge your fate, especially as regards morbidity, is only going to increase morbidity. You know what I mean? You can't dodge it. Look at Oedipus.
You think if you get past it, then it catches up with you the week after or something
Oedipus had full awareness of his fate. He couldn't dodge it no matter how hard he tried. So seriously, we would do the best we could. You know what I mean? And, maybe it would even work. It probably would. We might could buy the princess another 12 years of life, because that perfected ascendant is going to come back around again. And, the direction of one of the life-giving places to the killing planet or to a malefic, there are other things that can kill too. That's not the only lethal. That's not the only lethal direction in the zodiacal circle for a person. Any of the malefics, the rays of the malefics. In other words, when the moon gets when the moon is directed to 2748 degrees of Aries. That's going to be a terrible time period for her because she's going to be encountering the square aspect of Saturn there in the primary direction.
Yeah, so, the death chart, the chart at the time of her death definitely shows the problem, because if that Saturn is the killing planet, Neptune, transiting Neptune was conjunct that Saturn. It was very much stimulated by Neptune, and even transiting Uranus was perfectly conjunct natal Jupiter. And then you've got other factors like transiting Saturn is at the IC, so it's right there near the cusp of the fourth house of endings. And even the part of fortune, transiting part of fortune at the time of her death, it was conjunct Venus and Mercury in her seventh house, and the Mars was conjunct her Neptune in the 10th house. And I think that fact, this transiting Mars conjunct her Neptune, really describes the shock, the mourning, the confusion. Because I remember at the time, people were very confused about how that could have happened and what happened, and there was anger at Mars. So it's a chart that certainly does describe the event, and even the Sun. The transiting Sun was conjunct her natal Pluto in the 8th house of death, and transiting Pluto was conjunct her progressed part of fortune as well in the 11th house. So it's a very interesting chart. I think death charts are particularly useful testimonies, because when you look at a death chart, you really can't deny astrology.
No, you can't. Of course, they serve best in ex post facto situations. You know what I mean? We'd have to because we didn't know when to cast a death chart until after she's already dead, unfortunately. So they're no use to the princess herself, but they're of great use to us in terms of seeing how some of these operators what their condition is at the moment of death. Saturn, especially, being the significator of death. That is the one planet I would track that planet through all of her solar returns, etc. I would be on the lookout for that guy. And in the solar return of the year that she passed away, the significator of death is in the sign of his fall, and he's angular in the 7th house, antithetical to the ascendant, which is life. And Mars is in the sign of its fall, Libra, in opposition to the 7th in the ascendant. I would have said, man, this is going to be a tough year, Princess. Venus in France, in Leo, in the 11th house, going to party or whatever, going for dreams and hopes, having fun with friends, all of this good stuff with the Muslim Venus in France. You know what I mean? So these are all great starting points to really home in on everything is pointing at 1997 as the time of her death. We could even use the solar return chart, Steve, primary directions within it to time out the effects of the year when the death is going to happen.
Let's do that. Let's look at the solar return for that year, Stephen.
Oh, okay. Well, we've got like 10 minutes left in the show here, you know what I mean?
Oh, actually, we haven't really got time. Again, this is such a fascinating topic, and there's so much that we haven't even touched upon, like Charles, a really thorough review of Dodi Al-Fayed's chart, looking at her progression, looking at eclipses, looking at the Queen. There are just so many factors to be brought into this. So I suggest, Stephen, that we certainly do another show on Diana. It doesn't need to be our next show necessarily, but I think we need to have Diana show chapter 2.
Yeah, we can. I like the idea of using nativities of notable people to demonstrate different topics, because this is really the traditional method, how it's essentially used. Again, we look at the entirety of the chart to judge one topic, and then we judge another topic, and we discard the chart, metaphorically speaking, in that respect, and look at it anew in its totality as a gestalt, but only for that other topic, and we do this for all topics. So I like the idea of demonstrating topics such as marriage, fertility and childbirth, and fortune.
I would like us to definitely would like us to do that show on fertility and childbirth, because that's a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah, it is.
And it's a difficult one to handle. It's one of those inquiries that gets close to the question, when will I die? The question that we don't answer unless, there are exceptional circumstances under which I will. But that a client asking you whether they will have children is a tough one if you see that it's very unlikely, because it's such an important question for a person to be asking. But we have to handle that. It goes with the job.
It's tricky, too, because the astrologer has to be very much like a Supreme Court justice. You have to weigh testimony that might be competing. You know what I mean? It might be contradictory testimony. So there might be, for example, just a little preview here, talking about Josh Powell. People know him. He murdered his sons. Okay, his nativity is largely speaking against fertility. In other words, it's saying he probably isn't going to have kids, but if he does, it's going to be a really crappy situation. His kids are going to suffer misfortune, and he is going to suffer misfortune because of the kid. But he probably won't have them. You know what I mean? So that's how fertility is approached astrologically, but that's a great show, and we'll definitely do it. I want to remind everyone that you can find Stephen Frampton at stephenframpton.com, and he belongs to that tribe of Stephens who spell their name with a V. I am Stephen Lewis. You can find me at thegingerpsychic.com, find my articles there, and you can book appointments with either Stephen or myself from our respective websites, so just reach out to us, say hello. We'd love to meet you, and definitely keep listening to us every Friday night. We're going to be here with outstanding astrological tips that you can take into your own charts, and you'll notice your ability to judge those charts is going to improve by leaps and bounds. But that's all that I have.
Well, I just want to remind people, Stephen, that we make this show available through different channels.
Yes.
It is available on Blog Talk Radio, but it's going to be available on Stitcher. And it will also, it's always on YouTube. And actually, I was looking, Stephen, a lot of people are listening to the show on YouTube. We've had a lot of hits there, and we'll continue to find ways to make the show available through different channels. We need to look at iTunes, Stephen, but that's on our to-do list at some point. But great show, Stephen. I want to just encourage people to check out your site out and my site out and see what we have to offer. And you know, there are classes and workshops available as well as individual consultations. And we really enjoy doing this show, Stephen. It's always a lot of fun, isn't it?
It's excellent fun. I really look forward to these moments every single week, and you know, we're gonna be here for a long time to come. So definitely we'll see you guys next week. Come visit us, drop us a line or whatever, and we'll put the power of traditional astrology, modern astrology, to work for you. And so until next week, have a great week, everyone. Bye bye.